It seems that every fight on the right eventually turns into the same question. Who gets to tell you how to live, and how much power do they get to use doing it? Some call it conservatism, others nationalism, post-liberalism, even fusionism. But underneath the labels is the same old argument. Can liberty survive without virtue, and can virtue survive once politics gets its dirty hands on it? Stephanie Slade has spent years inside that argument, writing from a place some people might not expect. As a senior editor at Reason magazine, with a serious interest in religion, moral order, and the limits of state power. So today we're going to ask, is fusionism dead, or is it exactly what the new right forgot it needs? I'm Big John. Welcome to the Big Questions. And Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, really great. I think this is going to be an issue that, a lot of people touch on and they kind of swarm around. And I can't wait to talk about the new right, the politics around new right, what fusionism exactly is, how it harkens to the roots of conservative, all interesting stuff. But first, I want to learn a little bit about you. You studied economics and political science at the University of Florida. So, those are pretty serious and interesting majors to have. What were the questions that you had that first pulled you towards politics and this general interest in just ideas and institutions?
Great question. I mean, I don't know. I just always had an interest in this. I think my initial interest in politics came from watching the show The West Wing in high school and
Okay.
thinking that I was just very inspired by that. I think you hear that sometimes from people on the left. It's less common to hear from someone on the right, but it was the case for me. And I knew that I wanted to, that I was interested at least in coming to DC and doing something that touched on politics and government and all of that stuff. I enjoyed studying economics in college, and so there was that as well. And then over the years, I've also become interested in philosophy and theology and those questions, which all kind of bear on how do we build a good society? What does a good life look like? And what is human flourishing? Where does it come from? And how can we live together without killing each other?
And that sounds really, I think I've been speaking to more and more people recently that are arriving at that sort of questioning that you just described, especially people on the right. I think people, libertarians, free marketers, that they're now starting to question, okay, we've kind of proven what on a technical basis almost produces human prosperity in terms of technology, eliminating poverty to a great extent. I don't think people appreciate how much we've accomplished in the last 100 years just by applying free market principles around the world. But now the next stage seems to be here, which is like, okay, we've got all this prosperity around us, but are we flourishing as a species, as humans? So I do find that very interesting that in my lifetime, I've gone from being a kid who questioned, like, why can't people understand that a free market beats a fair market every time, to now we're saying, okay, we kind of take it for granted. That's what free markets do. But the flourishing part is very interesting. You moved into journalism and you also worked as a speechwriter and a pollster, which is sort of an interesting sort of transitional phase, I would say, if not a phase like where you ended up. But as a journalist and as a speechwriter and as a pollster, what kind of perspective did that give you on how actually politics works? I'm not talking about what we see on TV, whether it's President Trump or your local senator or councilman or whatever, but just the nature of politics, like in the Greek sense of the word. Politically, what did that give? What insights did you draw from that experience?
Well, I only spent about 3 years doing public opinion research, that's polling and focus groups, but that was it was very enlightening to be able to spend time really digging into what did the American people think about things? How do they react to things? And so I think those of us who work in politics full time can think that the conversations we're having, or I live in Washington D.C. The conversations that are happening here are reflective, or the conversations that are happening on Twitter are reflective of the average American, and it's so not true. It's so not true. And so, actually going out there and hearing from people and seeing what are they motivated by and how are they reacting to things was just very eye opening. So, one of the things I found that has stayed with me for all these years is that average Americans actually want to get along. I mean, you talk to regular people, whether they consider themselves like center left or center right, or even some people who would identify as being like, for example, we once did a focus group with women who identify as extremely pro-choice on the abortion issue. But I was amazed by how much crossover there was with people who identify as pro-life. If you don't work on those issues, you actually probably are very sympathetic to the perspective on the other side. And when you are presented with new information, you're willing to say, oh yeah, I had never thought of that. Maybe I should moderate my position a little bit. People are very reasonable, and they want to get along with their neighbors, and they don't want to consider the person who lives next door or across the street who votes for the opposite party as an enemy to be destroyed. That's not how people want to live, most people. But those of us in politics, and especially those who spend a lot of time online these days,
Oh, of
can
course.
lose sight of that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And you said so much in that answer, and I'm probably going to get back to it at some point because what you said was so interesting. I do agree with you that most people, I love to say in moments of stress, can we all just be reasonable? But of course, it's a loaded question. What's reasonable? Who defines what reasonable is, etc. But specifically to polling and trying to feed information back to candidates, back to policymakers. As a young man in the 80s in college, I always found it interesting that pollsters, in a way, just by the methods of they employ for their polls, can insert bias and their own viewpoints into the question. For example, you mentioned pro-choice, pro-life. If you could get wildly different results with basically the same question depending on the language you use, right? So if you could say, are you pro-choice, you might get a higher positive response than if you said, are you pro-abortion, right? Like the language itself, even though it's describing the same concept, how much of that do you feel comes into play? And I'm not talking about dirty secrets or anything, but do you feel that polling in the US is generally, and I'm struggling for the right phrase, an honest profession? Being a data science guy, I'm more interested in the purity of numbers, but I'm not blind to the fact that I can influence those numbers, especially when it comes to polling, right? Like we all understand the math behind it, what sampling is, and, uh, normal distributions and all that. The math is fairly clear. When applied to polling, though, you get this muddied water. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and where you feel that is in terms of?
Well, sure, sure. And part of it is that even though we understand about random sampling at a statistical level, we no longer live in a world where you can get a random sample of people to answer their phone and talk to you. And so that business model has been gone for a long, long time. So nowadays, by necessity, pollsters have to apply a lot of weighting and a lot of they have to manipulate their data in order to try to correct for the fact that they weren't able to get a random sample of people to answer the phone. So that is both an opportunity to introduce more bias, but I think to get to the root of your question, I think there are a lot of really honest, hardworking pollsters out there who are trying to get it right. Their reputation is on the line. If they give their candidate bad information, if they work for a candidate, that candidate's going to make bad choices. If they are a public-facing pollster, if they're doing polling on behalf of the New York Times or something, and they put out data that ends up being wrong, that's going to blow back on their reputation long term. So I think there are a lot of really honest, hardworking people trying to figure out in this moment where nobody answers their phones, we have to come up with new methodologies. How can we do the best? How can we do the best we can to get accurate information? Now, there are also a lot of other people out there. There are people who are trying to manipulate the conversation, and so they're, as you were alluding to, phrasing questions in certain ways in order to elicit a particular biased answer so that they can then put that out there in the hopes of influencing the conversation in some way. That definitely does happen. When a campaign releases internal polling numbers, you should know they're not required to do that. So if they're choosing to do it, it's because they want to put, an idea out there about how they're doing relative to the opposition. So that's something to know. If the campaign itself is releasing numbers, you take those numbers with a grain of salt, because if the numbers had gone the other way, they would have chosen to sit on them. They wouldn't have put them out there. So there's a lot. It is hard to be a sophisticated poll watcher, but I do think there's a lot of people who are trying their best, and so because we're at a moment where it's just hard to do well, and on any given year, some years the pollsters get it for an election, at least pre-election polling. Some years they get it pretty bang on, and sometimes they don't, and we just don't know until after the fact what it's going to be. And when it comes to non-election horse race polling, when we're just trying to get a sense of where does the public come down on an issue, one of the things I often say is, well, if you can look at trends over time, that's going to tell you something. That should tell you something. If you have only asked the question one time, we don't really know how accurate that is. But if you have trend over time, we can see what's changing over time. But then, of course, you have to look and see, did the methodology change during that trend also? So it is very complicated.
Yeah, it's extremely complicated. And, like I always used to tell, doing some marketing myself in my younger days, it was, there was always a difference between descriptive analysis and proscriptive analysis, right? And it's easy to your point, like, oh, we have to look at time, but that the methodology change. Is it the exact same question? Was it asked of the same type of sample? There's a lot. It's much more complicated than people think. I agree. To the extent that sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. Is polling still useful, in your opinion, for politicians, especially outside their base, right? So if you're trying to capture the independent, which it always seems to be the key now, right? Do you feel polling is still useful, or do you feel you're better off with something much more curated? You bring in, say, your target audience, your supporters, ask them questions, then bring opponents, ask them questions, rather than, say, just go out and trying to do a true random sample and trying to get sort of like the pulse.
I think there's value in both, and I think that's why you still see campaigns doing both focus groups and polls. I think that you just get something valuable from both of them, and you're kind of trying to triangulate the truth with imperfect information of various forms, and that's the best we can do in this world, I think.
You're right. Sometimes you just got to throw up your hands and say, the glory is in the fight, not the result, right? So, fair enough. Okay, so now, as you transitioned into journalism, was there a particular moment trying to look at when you kind of looked at the ideological battles going on, and was there something that was more interesting, say, about intra-ideological battles on the right as opposed to the left? Or am I making an assumption here? Did you feel there's a more interesting ideological battle on the right than the left?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there are very interesting ideological battles also happening on the left. In a real sense, I think both the left and the right have been, in the last 5 or 10 years, sort of undergoing intra-movement civil wars, ideological civil wars within their respective camps. But I started my career mostly writing about things. Religious liberty was sort of my first beat at Reason magazine. And so I was defending the importance of individual liberty, and specifically religious liberty, from attacks that I mostly saw during, say, the tail end of the Obama era, coming from the left. And I was somebody who's kind of on the right, who's defending things I believe in against attacks from the left. This is pretty standard. But over time, I started noticing that there were also attacks to individual freedom, not just religious liberty, but all various forms of individual liberty that I care about, that were also coming from the right. They were increasingly coming from the right. And there was increasingly an open debate on the right about what does it mean to be a conservative in the American context, what kind of philosophy ought to be animating and motivating the Republican Party, what kind of candidates are going to get nominated and elected to high office. And there were two really, really vividly different visions for that I saw emerging. One of which was a sort of old school, what you might call Reagan-style conservatism, classically liberal, free market, limited government, rule of law, free trade, all of that, individual freedom. You think of Reagan saying that the scariest words in the English language is, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. It's very limited government, individual freedom, personal responsibility, that sort of thing. But then there was this totally foreign-seeming new philosophy or vision that said, we tried all that classical liberal individual liberty, free market stuff. And we do not like the world that we are now living in as a result of that. And so instead, we want the right to embrace a more muscular use of state power in order to advance the causes we believe in. And we want to be willing to use the power of the state to, in some cases, they would say, reward our friends and punish our enemies, to impose or at least encourage people to live virtuous lives as we understand them, and to also be willing to use regulation and government policy to try to produce outcomes within the market that we think are better than others. We don't just trust the free market to produce good outcomes. We think we can sort of manipulate it, or in some sense bring about improved outcomes. So those are all big departures. Those are two very different visions, and they're both happening within the right. And it's been very interesting to watch this debate sort of break out, and to see this new right, or in my forthcoming book, I call it the dissident right. They're dissenting from the old school Reagan-style conservatism and free market conservatism, and they're pushing this alternate view. And these dissenters have really captured a lot of the oxygen in the room in the last few years, and especially seem to be having a lot of success with winning over young conservatives. And so that's been very interesting to watch. I was watching this with kind of increasing alarm and confusion, and wanted to understand what was going on here. Why is this happening? And is there anything that I, as somebody who does believe in individual liberty and rule of law and free markets, can do to try to make the case that this is a mistake?
Yeah, and just listening to you talk right now, and I apologize for generalization here, but compared to myself and the gray hairs I have on my head, I kind of view you as this young person in my eyes. I don't know how old you are, and I don't really care to know, but it's really just, looking at you, I said, oh, there's a young person who's, really working hard, on this sort of ideological study and journey, right? But everything you described, I would venture to say I was basically even younger than you were during the Reagan Revolution, and being exposed to Milton Friedman, and being exposed to, at least initially, Barry Goldwater and what his conservatism meant, and then you go into the Buckleys, William F. Buckley, and then you find out about Frank Meyer and the fusion. So when do you while the ideological battle on the right, I can very clearly see, and I see distinct moments, where it became more interventionist, more neocon, willing to use the state. But as we see it now, I'm shocked right now at how many so-called conservatives, and I'll generalize it by saying the MAGA movement. You could choose another phrase for it, but it's being epitomized by, say, President Trump and his followers. That at some point, do they actually realize how much they've gone in their minds so muscularly to the right that they've come all the way around to the left again? At one point, I was fond of saying during, say, the 2016 campaign that President Trump's economic policy probably had more in common with Bernie Sanders than it did with, say, Milton Friedman or Hayek or anybody like that, right? That he was never interested in free trade. He was interested in what he described as fair trade. We know the situation with tariffs and with the government taking state in businesses. Do you think it's still fair to call, I don't know, would you call that the new right now? If you called it the new right, let's use that term, at least in terms of, say, economic policy, that they've come they've pictured themselves becoming so muscular that they've come right back around to the paternalistic liberalism, say, to be kind, or maybe statism, hardcore leftists. It's just it's just their end goals might be different, but the mechanisms are the same. Do you think the irony is lost on these folks, or are they just okay with it?
It depends who you're talking about. I think I would venture to say that the average Trump voter probably is not thinking in those terms, and is probably not quite aware of what they're of how similar the things that they're sort of lining up for are to what, say, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren might like. And in fact, I've written about some explicit overlap between things that, for example, Josh Hawley or Marco Rubio even were calling for, that were almost identical to legislation introduced by Elizabeth Warren, requiring, for example, she wanted to require all corporate boards to give over some of the seats on their boards to worker representatives, basically union members. And this would be a transfer of wealth away from the owners to the union members, and it would be required by law. And it's very much an Elizabeth Warren left progressive kind of thing, quite extreme on the left. And there are voices on the right that are like, yeah, we ought to be doing that too. Tucker Carlson referred to Elizabeth Warren as an economic patriot. So this is definitely a sort of, they call it horseshoe theory, when you come all the way around and you go so far to the right that you somehow end up on the left. I've written about right-wing progressivism is another way to talk about it. It's definitely happening at the more elite levels. Members of Congress, and thought leaders, they understand it. Does the average voter understand it? I don't think so. I think the average voter, for the most part, the average Trump voter, let's say, thinks what they think is, I feel like the left is hostile to me and people like me, and I think that Trump is going to have my back. He's going to be on my side against the people who hate me. And I think that's what's motivating most regular people, not some sort of analysis of the policy. And most people just don't think. They're not economists. They don't think these things through that much, but they know who they feel like is on their side and who they feel like is hostile to them. And they feel like the Democrats are hostile to me, and Trump seems like he will have my back. And so that's kind of what's going on when it comes to, I think, the electorate. But what in practice is happening is now they're abandoning those sort of commitments to free trade, free markets, that rule of law. I have very big rule of law concerns, especially in the second Trump administration, that I don't think the people were intentionally voting for that. I think they thought they were voting for, an end to wokeness and lower prices, and they didn't realize what all that was going to come with that package.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I do want to sort of transition into how religion and virtue kind of intertwine with this. But before we kind of transition into that, I do agree with you, and I do think people don't understand. Like when I heard President Trump announced that he wanted to cap interest rates, and because those dirty banks are robbing the American person and it's usury and all that, I was fascinated that Jamie Dimon came out. In full disclosure, somebody I used to work for, and he said, "Look, the banks are going to be fine no matter what law you pass. But what you're kneecapping is people's ability to use their credit cards as their emergency fund, because that's the state of the American economy." And you're right. That, to me, I'm saying, like, did I hear President Trump say that, or was that actually Elizabeth Warren using some AI voice changer to sound like Trump? Right, because it was straight out of, was it the Financial Consumer Protection Board or whatever she had come up with, right? It, while I agree with you that the average voter may not be aware of this horseshoe effect, or I guess my question is, do you feel that the people advising the president or the president himself are aware of this horseshoe effect, and they just simply don't care because they were never true believers in conservatism, if we want to use that word? Or do you feel this is a deliberate, like, we don't care as long as, to your point, we get to evade the rule of law and do whatever we want?
I think the people around Trump now, in the second Trump administration, were explicitly chosen to be people who were true believers in his agenda and who would stand with him and would not in any way try to inhibit his moving the party in this direction. And that was a pretty explicit decision made by the people around the Trump campaign heading into the second term, was to find people who would, there were a lot of people in the administration the first time around who were still Barry Goldwater-ish kind of free market people, and they were trying to hold the line on that stuff. And this time around, they said, we don't want any of that. We want people who will do what we, who will be fully in line with our vision and our agenda, which is this much more economically progressive and as well as contemptuous of rule of law in many ways. And Vice President J.D. Vance, in his memoir Hillbilly Elegy, there's a great example of what you're describing, which is in his memoir. He talked about how things like advanced payday loans was actually like elite members, sort of elite members of Congress or the legislature might think like this is predatory. It's exploiting poor people. They charge these outrageous interest rates to get your check cashed in advance. We should ban this. It's taking advantage of people. And he said the people trying to make their ends meet, and this is the difference between whether they can pay their rent or not, or put food on the table for their kids or not. If you take that option away, you're not making their life better. You're making their life worse. He recognized that and he wrote about it in his book. But now he's sort of gone over to the side of people who have adopted this line of like, this is gross, it's exploitative, and we should ban it. The government needs to do, on behalf of the common good, the government needs to take away the ability for people to do things that we consider to be unvirtuous, and high interest rate, payday loans are the kind of an example of that. So you saw him flip. You saw him flip up on many things, and it was a clearly a conscious decision on his part to say, this is the future that I think that I see the trends going in this direction, and I want to be part of it. And anybody who doesn't essentially line up with those views would find it quite hard to get a job in this administration. Again, there were explicit decisions that said things like, for example, in the olden days, you would find most conservatives saying things like, we're in favor of legal immigration. Our problem is with illegal immigration, but we're all for legal immigration, and we just want people to come here the right way. That's the kind of thing you would hear a Republican saying. But going into this second Trump term, the people who were doing the hiring said, we're asking people, and we want people who know that there needs to be less immigration overall, legal and illegal. We don't care. We want fewer foreigners in our country. And that was an explicit thing. Or if you talked about the importance of deregulation, they were like, out of here. That means that you're not on the same page as us. We're not deregulators. We want a muscular state that's not afraid to act. So I think that was a conscious choice. And they handpicked people who were going to sort of be willing to get behind that.
Yeah, that is fascinating. J.D. Vance in particular, I find fascinating because of not just that he flipped, but he flipped in such a compressed time frame to the point where he's now obviously the heir apparent to MAGA once Trump leaves office. If Trump leaves office, we don't know yet. But I want to do a slight transition here. You mentioned like the fervor of the people and the knowledge of the people as voters, the cadre around the president and the new right movement, which goes beyond the president when I say new right, obviously. Fusionism, which is a subject that I think you're very interested in. During the Reagan administration, yes, I was alive and interested in President Reagan's movement. Fusionism to me back then meant trying to get libertarians and conservatives together, right? That was like the old, to me, it was William F. Buckley, right? And I could sit and talk to him for a while, and you could see where he was heading. He was Catholic, he was very conservative, but he appreciated certain libertarian points. I remember laughing that he wanted to find out what smoking pot was like, so he got on his yacht, went beyond the 3-mile limit, smoked pot, came back and wrote about it, right? So that was, to me, a very Buckley thing to do, and it was a very conservative thing of the 80s to do, right? So we're dabbling in libertarianism. Let's find that middle ground, because together we can hold back the tide of leftist initiatives in this country, of progressivism in this country. In the 80s, I always said it was a mistake for the Reagan Revolution to so heartily embrace people based solely on religion and based solely on religious belief in this country. To me, there was always a difference from saying the state is not going to prevent you from practicing your religion. We're not going to be anti-religion. We're not going to show anti-religious bias. That's one thing. I was fine with that. But it was another thing to actively court folks into your movement based solely on religion. I always thought that was a political mistake. And to me, when fusionism went from, in my definition, from that to trying to weave religion and politics together, I thought the Republican Party was heading for bad news. And I believed that in the 80s, and I believe it now. So, tell me what fusionism is, from your point of view, because my definition probably doesn't align with yours or anybody else's for that matter. Let's start with that. What is fusionism? I know you were big, you talk a lot about it, you write a lot about it. What is fusionism for the folks that don't know?
Yeah, and in fact, I have a book coming out in a couple of months called Fusionism. So if people who are really interested will be able to read the book length version pretty soon.
And we'll get that up on the screen. But yeah, definitely.
Yes. So What I'm trying to do when I write about and talk about fusionism is actually to get people out of the habit of thinking of it in terms of a coalition. You have your conservatives and you have your libertarians, and we want them to play nicely together. We want to bring them into an alliance, and we want to get them to play nicely and vote for the same people, because that's the road to electoral success. Now, if you're in electoral politics, you do have to put together winning coalitions, and that's the only way that Reagan becomes president, is by doing that. So I don't mean to say that that's not a thing that's going to be happening. But fusionism actually was something that came about 20 years earlier, before Reagan. It was a set of ideas that was associated with National Review magazine, and even more than Buckley, it was this guy named Frank Meyer, who's been somewhat forgotten to history, but he was an influential, senior editor. He was the book section editor at National Review, and what he was doing was not so much focusing on a coalition. He was talking about the first principles. What does it mean to be a conservative in America? And what are the philosophical underpinnings of this movement that we're building? And it was a he argued, and I agree. It's a synthesis between the classical liberal political tradition, which again is all about individual liberty, limited government, rule of law, that sort of thing, and the Judeo-Christian moral tradition. That you need to have a fusion of these two things in order to have a good society. In other words, liberty and virtue are both necessary for human flourishing. That's how I shorthand it when people say, what is fusionism? For me, it is the idea that liberty and virtue are both necessary for human flourishing, and we have to care about both of them. And they're mutually reinforcing. And if you only have one, the other one's not going to last. If you only are focusing on one of them, then it's going to all fall apart. So that's the idea. We need people to live virtuous lives. We need them to be caring about, what do I do with my freedom? What does it mean to use freedom well to build a good life? What are my obligations to other people and to my society? And those questions matter. That's about virtue. It's about good, habit formation and moral formation and virtue. And the Judeo-Christian moral tradition, I think, offers a lot of really important guidance for answering those questions. But I do not think that it is appropriate use of state power to impose that from the top down on people, to make that decision once and for all for everybody based on whoever's in the White House or whichever party's in control of government. I think, so this is where the classical liberal tradition comes in, the libertarian side of things, which says government's job is to protect our life, liberty, and property, basically, right? Our basic rights and liberties. That's government's job, to keep the peace and carve out space so that we can use that freedom and that space to pursue virtue, to pursue good lives. But it's up to us to do that. It's not up to the government to do that for us. It has this sort of a narrow set of functions, which is protect people's basic rights and liberties, and then get out of the way. That's fusionism, as far as I'm concerned. It says liberty and virtue are both necessary. Government's job is to do the liberty piece, so that we can then use that liberty to do the virtue piece.
It's funny. Everything that you just said, I agree with 100%. But I will still push back, because I will ask you this, a sort of analogous thing that was coursing through my empty head right about now as you were speaking was, I was reminded of Milton Friedman saying, the society that goes for equality before liberty will get neither, but the society that goes for liberty will have a higher degree of both. And that to me was very wise, in the sense that you'll never get to the perfect state, but here's the best we can do for now, given liberty, given virtue, without the mechanisms attached necessarily for this question, do you feel one is a stronger partner than the other? Or do you feel they're equal? Or how would you, like, if I was giving you the chance to engineer society, which if you're a good libertarian, I know you would never accept that role, but let's assume for this thought experiment, what would you try to implement first? Like a government that protects individual liberty, or some sort of structure that either teaches or imposes virtue?
It's really hard to answer the question, because the whole basically idea of fusionism is that they're both non-negotiable. You can't only have one or the other. I think that, though, Frank Meyer wrote explicitly, he said virtue is the more important of the two. He said liberty is a precondition for us to live virtuous lives. If we don't have political freedom, then we can't actually cultivate our moral capacity and our talents and abilities to pursue excellence, which is a big part of what it means to be virtuous. And so liberty is a precondition for the pursuit of virtue, but he said virtue is the point of life. Like we were, if you believe, again, sort of drawing on the Judeo-Christian moral tradition, if you believe we were created in the image of God and we were endowed with free will and we have equal inherent dignity, and God wants us to use those capacities that he gave us to pursue excellence in various ways. And that's the whole point of life, is to do that. None of that is possible if you're living under a sort of totalitarian hellscape. So we have to have that political freedom, but that's not the ultimate highest good. He would say, virtue is higher, actually. So that's Frank Meyer, who was quite libertarian. But we go back to the founding. I mean, we're in this 250th anniversary year of the signing of the Declaration, and I wrote something for a reason in our latest issue of the magazine on this. I think the founding was quite fusionist in the sense that the founders were both drawing upon the wisdom of the Judeo-Christian moral tradition, and they were also drawing upon the sort of classical liberal tradition of that time, reading Montesquieu and Locke and all of that. And part of what we mean, I think, when we talk about American exceptionalism is that those two traditions came together at the founding in a way that was unique in history. They had never quite been fused in that way before. And that's part of what made us so special. And the founders believed very deeply, and we have so many examples of quotes. Probably the one that maybe has been heard by the most people would be John Adams saying, "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." In other words, we need that virtue in order for a limited government, the sort of structure of government of a free society, to survive. It's not going to survive unless the people are virtuous. So it goes both ways. You need freedom in order for people to pursue virtue. You also need virtue in order for limited government and freedom, political freedom, to last. Without it, we're inevitably going to descend into a situation where if people can't trust their neighbors to live virtuously, make good on their promises, have each other's backs, help each other up when times of trouble, then they're going to turn to government to do those things. And we're going to have an ever-increasing government. So you can't have limited government. You can't have individual liberty for very long if you don't have virtue also. So I think it's sort of it's circular. So it's really hard to choose one or the other.
Yeah, I can understand that. But I guess what I'm also thinking about, and I'd love your perspective, not just as a wise person who's put a lot of thought into this, but also generationally. My generation of libertarians, and I'm a Milton Friedman guy. I predate the Ron Paul guys, right? Whenever you got into these discussions with folks, political discussions, philosophical discussions, I always felt it was incumbent on me, as someone who did believe in individual liberty and free markets and volunteerism, the whole nine yards, to never make an argument and inject religion into it. Never try to, like, even if it was abortion, it was never like, oh, this is, anti-Christian or whatever, right? Because back then, people in my position viewed it as weakening your argument. That if you had to somehow inject religion into your argument, you've lost the argument. Now I get the sense, not just from you necessarily, but just in general, that individualists, libertarians, classical liberals even, don't feel that sort of restriction, right? That they don't feel that they can, that they feel the need to not use religion in any sort of way. Now, you use the word virtue. You also said Judeo-Christian religion, right? Are the two interchangeable in your vocabulary, or is it possible, say, for an atheist to be virtuous? Is it possible for a non-Judeo, like a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Taoist or something, to also exhibit this virtue? And I know the answer is yes to that, but I mean, in terms of your framework, how does that work?
Yeah, so the point is not that you have to be a Christian or a Jew or a believer of any kind, really. It's whether you think that there is wisdom that's been handed down through that tradition about how to build a good life and how to live our lives and what our obligations are to each other and that sort of thing. And so my understanding of when I talk about virtue, because I think anybody can use that word, and it can mean a million different things, and somebody on the left is going to believe that the things that they're fighting for are virtuous, right? They in fact, we sometimes we'll accuse them of virtue signaling, right? So like they believe that the things that they're fighting for are moral. So it's not just about that. It's about whether it's rooted in a particular tradition, a sort of moral tradition that I think is the source of the truth. I mean, I think it's objectively true. I think, again, it's what the founders believed in, and I think it's the best way to if you're actually trying to answer questions about how to use your freedom to live a good life. There's just a huge amount of wisdom here that we can't be treating as disposable. But of course, when you're talking about just your dialogue that you're having with another person, or political debates or whatever, then you know your audience. And if you're talking to somebody who's not religious, then I wouldn't argue in those terms for them. But what I'm finding in my research, I didn't necessarily go in expecting this. But what I found is that young people, especially young people sort of on the broad speaking right, but even center left, that young people in general are very hungry for help answering these sort of deep existential questions about how to build a good life. Because in generations past, I think there was a sense of that there's a script that you follow. You know, you go to school, you get married young, you have family, you go to, you know, whatever. And that's kind of been blown up. Now, in some ways, that's good. Like, we don't want everybody to feel like they have to live in a sort of rigidly constrained, all exactly the same way. And I think it's obviously a very good thing that, for example, women can have careers of their own now, and I'm not chained to the kitchen, and my whole job is just to be a housewife, or that's the only option available to me. But when you don't have sort of clear scripts that everybody's just following, and it seems like anything goes, and literally anything goes, you can just choose your gender on any given day. You can choose to be what you want to be. Then young people feel this sense of like adriftness. They have no idea how to live. They don't even know what a good life looks like. They have been given and everybody around them seems unwilling to. They don't want to be. Oh no, it's for you to figure out. It's not my job to judge you or to tell you how to live. It's for you to figure out. And they're like, but well, I'm young and stupid, and I don't know how to live a good life. And so they're going and looking. They're hungry for answers to these questions. And if we, as libertarians, as classical liberals, are afraid to engage on those questions, not of what should government say, but what should you choose? How should you be pursuing a good life? If we don't have anything to say to them, if we don't have any inherited wisdom to pass on to them to help them make those decisions, they're going to go looking for answers somewhere. And what I'm finding is that a lot of them are going to find those answers on sort of the dark corners of the alt-right internet. And that's what they're going to find. And that's how they're going to start living their lives.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I do want to transition into the new right, so-called new right. But what I found interesting about what you just said is, again, goes back to sort of this concept that when people don't have to worry literally about where their next meal is coming from. And I don't think people appreciate how much we've eliminated really crushing poverty in our world today, right? Whereas 100, 150 years ago, it was more accurate to say 99% of the world lives in abject poverty. And truly the 1% is the affluent people that don't have to worry about their next meal or a roof over their head. That pretty much for the most part, especially in the United States, that ratio is reversed now, right? Like, people really don't have to worry. Think about Judeo, give us today our daily bread, and things of that nature. So I think part of what you're describing, and I've seen this in my lifetime, is that shift where, my nephew and niece, they're like, Uncle John, we can't find jobs where we're happy with what we're doing. And to me, someone of my generation, I kind of get it. I'm a hybrid with it. My father's generation would have just laughed at that statement, right? It's like, you're not supposed to be happy at work. You're supposed to feed your family by having a job. You're supposed to pay your rent, buy your house, whatever. And I think that sort of thing, like, when did it become a requirement that your job had to make you happy, right? I know to young people today, that sounds like, what's that old fool talking about right now? But I think that contributes a lot to what you just described, this aimlessness, this
Yeah.
being adrift. And that's why certain people, like we had Brink Lindsay on a couple of weeks ago, and he described this, like, where's the flourishing? Where's the human flourishing? Now that we don't have to worry about human suffering as much, where's the flourishing? And for a while there in the early 90s, I would even argue it's what drove a lot of young people into radicalism of various sorts, right? Whether political or religious radicalism, because they didn't know what else to do with their lives, right? They're, like you said, they're adrift, and along come these radical ideologies, and they're like, we've got a purpose for you. Let me tell you what it is, right? And then all of a sudden we see where that leads. So, having said that on my part, describe the new right to me right now. What is the new right? I know a lot of people are tempted to say, oh, it's Trump, but it's not that, is it?
No, so okay, I'll start with this. We are very used to thinking of politics in terms of a left-right spectrum, right? Left and right. What I think the last decade or so has shown is that we actually need to add a second dimension to this, which is what I would call liberal illiberal. And by liberal, I don't mean left, right? I mean classical liberal. I mean, concern with individual liberty, limited government, rule of law, individual rights, let's say. And so what you have is this divide. You have left versus right, but then you also have liberal versus illiberal. And then you end up with 4 quadrants where you can have a liberal left and an illiberal left, a liberal right and an illiberal right. You could call it libertarian authoritarian if you don't like the word liberal, if that's confusing. But what we've seen now is there's this live debate, again, on both sides. I think it's happening on both sides, but I'm focused on the right in my work, between those who are on the right and who still believe in individual rights, limited government, that sort of thing, and those who say, again, this was a mistake. No, forget all that. This is not the way to structure a good society. What we need is a strong ruler. We need a strong muscular government that can use the power of the state. That's not so squeamish about using the power of the state to advance the things we believe in and to help people live those good lives. So it's the disagreement about, what is the route to human flourishing? And is it through freedom, or is it through more or less freedom, more or less government, more or less versus the alternative? And that's the divide that's opened up. And so you see this very open debate happening now. And you've even seen, I know you're interested in institutions. I've written a lot about within the institutional conservative movement. So all of the think tanks and publications and advocacy organizations and the party and all of that, you're seeing a sort of sorting where there are still many of those institutions that believe in a sort of old school, again, Reaganite, classically liberal, limited government, conservatism. And then you have some organizations that have what I would describe as being a little bit provocative, gone over to the dark side. And you've seen a bunch of new institutions that have grown up, being founded to be on that other side of that divide, to say we reject this whole classical liberal thing. We think liberalism is part of the problem. And so there's new institutions that have been formed, new publications, magazines, websites, new think tanks, new advocacy organizations that are on the post-liberal or anti-liberal side of that divide. And so when I'm talking about the new right, or again, in my book, I say dissident right, I'm talking about that quadrant of the 4-quadrant map. The dissident right or the new right are the anti-liberal, anti-classically liberal, right-wing folks who they're not on the left exactly, although there's overlap on some policy issues as we discussed. But they're on the right in important ways, but they're not conservatives in a way that would have been recognizable to Ronald Reagan.
Mm. And yet they still try to claim his legacy, do they not?
Some do, some don't, though. Actually, one of the lines that I've heard that's sort of become ubiquitous in the last 10 years as a way for folks in that camp to disparage people like us would be that we are zombie Reaganists. In other words, Reaganism, it's the Walking Dead. It's best left in the 20th century. It has no relevance to us today. So you hear that sometimes.
Yeah, I guess. And I mean, look, things evolve. I get that. What was true in the 80s for me in the 90s isn't going to be necessarily true today. But when it comes to first principles, like you mentioned earlier, do you see a sort of like a standard deviation, say, away from first principles of conservatism? Because to some extent, I could argue whether you were talking about, say, 80s conservatives or 80s libertarians, whether you were talking about Ron Paul or William F. Buckley, first principles were generally aligned, I would argue. And it was mainly the last 10% that you argued about, Catholic integralism or something like that, and you were worried about that last 10%. Whereas now, I don't know that I can make that same sort of statement about this dissident right. Like, do you feel their first, aside from the methodologies they would employ, whether the state becomes a coercive for good? Like, okay, so are they saying let's use the government to coerce back to first principles that Reagan would have recognized, and it's just the methodology that's different? Or are those first principles also scattered to the wind?
And it depends on the person. And in my book, I talk about, actually, I break down the new right into 3 different camps, which is even still an oversimplification. And so it depends who you're talking about. There are some who are quite religiously oriented, the Catholic integralists, the Christian nationalists, like, the theocon types. And some of their first principles are going to be the same as mine, some of them, and they just disagree about whether or not they can be imposed by force. Although I would argue that is a first principle. Like, I think that part of why I'm a libertarian is because I'm a Christian, and because I believe that every human person was created in the image of God, and therefore it's wrong for some individual or or subset of the population to tread on and run roughshod over the rights and freedoms of others, because we were all created equal by God. So that is a first principle for me. My libertarianism is a first principle. But there are some who just disagree. There certainly are some who just disagree about methods. I'm sure that's true. But a lot of it, I think, is quite an explicit and definitive break at the level of principles. And they just say, your principles are wrong. And some people, some of them, in the more extreme cases, would say even the American founding was a mistake. The American founding was founded on the wrong principles. And we need a new founding, or a refounding is the kind of thing you'll sometimes hear out of those quarters. So they really are going to the root of it and saying, we reject this whole lineage we think was a wrong turn.
So, and this is fascinating to me, if you're of that belief, which I disagree with, but okay, people can differ. But if you just believe that America was founded on the wrong principles, this has been a 250-year experiment that's been a failure from year one, why even throw in and even come close to identifying? See, to me, if I believe that, I would just be loud and proud about it. I'd be like, yeah, this was all a mistake. Let's go try something else. Back to the Stone Age, if that's what it takes, right? But why still the mask? Why still the drape of conservatism in some form or another?
Well, some of them are pretty loud and proud, and online especially. And you would not believe the number of bloggers and.
You're talking about like the Nick Fuentes types, right?
Well, yeah, but it's not just him. There is a whole ecosystem that has grown up sort of around him and people like him,
Right.
Bloggers, podcasters, YouTubers, and they have a following, quite a large following of disaffected young men, mostly, not only, but mostly, and so there's that is happening, and they're becoming ever more radicalized all the time, and they're going farther and more explicitly into white nationalism and things like that, Christian nationalism, white nationalism, in a way where they're not trying to, because a lot of them are hiding behind anonymous Twitter avatars or whatever. They feel very comfortable being loud and proud about it. But even some of the people who are out there under their own names are doing it, and that's a thing. And even if it's a fringe, if it's a relatively small percentage of the whole population, I do worry a lot about the fact that it seems to be capturing seducing many young people. So right now it's a fringe view, but what will it be in 10 years? I don't know, or 20 years, I don't know. So that's why I think we have to fight back against it. We have to pay attention to that. Now the other thing I want to reiterate, though, is that I do think it is not the majority of like your average American, your average voter, buying into this. I think most people, going back to those focus groups I used to do, most people want to live in peace with their neighbors and coexist peacefully with people, even if they disagree with them on politics, even if they don't share their religion. Most people do want that. Most people are horrified and appalled by the rise of Nick Fuentes and this white nationalist stuff. They're not, this is not the average American. This is not taking over the whole Republican Party, but it is growing, and it does seem to be, particularly appealing to young men. And so I do worry about that.
I mean, at one point we would have said the same thing about radical Islam in the United States, right? Like disaffected young men who felt, that they had no lot in life, they had no direction, and radicalized Islam gave them that sort of path. To some young women as well, I would say. In some religious circles, you see a return to Christian orthodoxy in a lot of cases, because that's a more structured version than, say, Catholicism or Protestantism. Do you feel that wrapper has always been a certain segment of the population, a certain percentage of the population, and it's just the wrapper that's changed, whether it's a particular religion, a particular ideology? Or do you feel that this is getting increasingly worse, either A, because of the environmental conditions of, if you're fed and at home but have nothing to do, then this, there's more people being pushed because of that? Or is it just say social media, that now we're exposed to more of this, that vocal sliver of a minority now has a bigger megaphone, and that's putting ideas in people's heads? Do you feel that this segment is roughly, like, if we were to somehow quantify it in 1950, 1980, and 2025, 2026, is it, in your opinion, do you think it's roughly the same percentage of the disaffected, or is it growing?
It's a little hard to be for me to be very definitive about this. There are some. So here's a statistic that I like. There's this idea of affective polarization, which means that people on the left and people on the right dislike each other more intensely now than they used to. And one of the questions they use to test this is they ask in a poll, how would you feel if your child married somebody of the opposite party? And they also ask a different religion, a different race, whatever. But on how would you feel if your child married somebody from the opposite party? And the number of people who say that they would be very upset if their child married somebody from the other party has like tripled or quadrupled in the last 10 years. Okay, so that's a sign that affective polarization is getting worse. We are coming to hate each other more. However, when I dug into those numbers and I wanted to understand them more, what I realized was they have doubled or tripled or quadrupled. I think they may have, but it went from something like 4% to 15% of the population who feels this way. So it's still actually a small minority of all Americans who would be really upset if they're now. So it's getting worse, but it's not like taking over the country, or we're not there yet. The vast 80% of Americans would still be like, it would be okay. Or maybe I wouldn't be thrilled, but like I would get over it. That's the normie position. And so this, I think, is a good way of getting some perspective on the matters. The problem could be getting worse. We could be coming to hate each other more, but I still think that it's not like as bad as some of the people would make it out to be on that. So, okay, that's one statistic just to like put it all in perspective. On the other hand, you're right that, and in fact, I think like 10, I guess it's more than 10, in 2008, when Ron Paul ran for president, and 2008 and 2012, part of the reason that there was a lot of excitement around the Ron Paul phenomenon was, I think, and libertarians like us, like me and Reason, we benefit from this, that young people have always been attracted to sort of provocative envelope pushing edgy ideas, right? And libertarianism at that time was that. It offered this pushing the envelope, being kind of provocative, like we want to legalize heroin, like this is edgy, right? And so young people are always attracted to that. That's always been the case. And now what we have is this other set of ideas that like libertarianism seems tame to young people today. Like that is nothing to them. Instead, it's like, should women be denied the right to vote is the edgy, provocative kind of inflammatory stuff. And should all brown people be sent back to the countries they came from is the edgy, provocative stuff. And so these ideas are the ones that young people who are attracted to transgressive ideas and are dabbling in and being attracted to. And in some ways that's natural because that's always happened. And they just happen to be ideas that I find a lot more disturbing now than they used to be. But whether it's going to continue, whether they're going to continue to hold these views over time is such an open question. I have no idea. But I do think that you have to fight. You have to go and do battle where the battle is happening. If they're being seduced by these ideas, somebody needs to show up and argue against them and try to pull them back from the brink. So that's kind of what has motivated a lot of my work in recent years.
And I agree with you. There's something that's always been rock and roll about just going against what your parents believed in. That's very natural. I think all of us at one point or another were teenagers and we remember what that was like. But everyone always expected that you grow out of that phase, right? Like you may stick to your beliefs that you encountered or discovered when you were a youngster. But I would think that if the reason you latched onto those beliefs was simply as an act of rebellion, that would probably fade over time, right? If you had a true epiphany, a true realization, I could see where that sticks with you. Like you said, Ron Paul moment for you. For me, it was Milton Friedman on the Donahue show. You hit those things and you're like, oh, that's cool. And then as you go older, you go, wait a second, let me think about it some more. And you might land on that. Do you feel that this new dissident right is it really just that teen rebellion type of thing? Or is it more that this is more of a behavioral or something that actually is starting to convert people into, this is a belief system I have that women shouldn't vote, and if you're not white, get out of the country type of thing?
It's hard to answer this question. I hope that it's just a phase and we'll grow out of it. And there is this really interesting thing that's going to happen, which is sooner or later we will be in the post-Trump moment. And there will be, whether it's because he dies or whether because he leaves office or whatever, like there will come a time after Trump, sooner or later. And what the conservative movement and the Republican Party in the country will look like after that is this open question right now that we're all kind of just starting to try to figure out. And I think it could go a lot of different ways. And it could potentially, best case scenario, be an opportunity for a sort of hard reset where people, like, the fever burns itself out and you kind of people can kind of come back to their senses and start thinking again about how to move forward in a more rational way. Here's a really important thing, though. I believe that a huge driving force behind the radicalization of the right and the far right in recent years is the prior radicalization of the far left.
Yes.
I think it is absolutely a reaction. This is a reactionary phenomenon. I think sort of woke or runaway political correctness, identity politics, that sort of stuff. Some of which was I think totally well intentioned in the beginning, but it got so out of control in some quarters, and it caused a whole generation of young people to grow up, sort of come up knowing nothing but the far left hates me and is hostile to me and thinks I am the enemy. And if you're a young straight white man, you've just been told that a young person now has been told that his whole life, that's all he's ever known. And your job is to sit down and shut up and listen to your moral betters. It's their turn, and you're going to be denied equal opportunities because you have privilege, even though you personally never benefited from that privilege or did any of the sort of oppressing of other groups, but your demographic category is guilty, and so now the collective guilt is being passed down to you, and your job is to just take it and be happy about it. And it shouldn't be any surprise to us that human beings would not react kindly to sort of feeling that message, being bombarded with that message for their whole life, and that they would eventually react against that and lash out against that and say, I don't care about any of these other things. I care about somebody who will fight for me against what feels like this hostile force. And some of that, I think they're reacting against real things that were happening in the world. I also think that there were some examples of some extreme examples coming out of the left that were then came into the right-wing echo chamber and were we just hear on Fox News over and over and over again, or on talk radio, or on the blog, or the in the podcast sphere, or whatever. You might have one crazy person on a college campus who shouts down a speaker, and we will hear about that forever. And you will think that every conservative speaker is now being shouted down. And it's a little hard to disentangle how real and how pervasive is the problem on the left. But people on the right, I think, feel that the problem is very serious, and that's a huge part of what's driving all of this. So because that was a real thing that they're reacting against. All of these things really did happen. Maybe they've been blown out of proportion, but they weren't invented. They weren't imagined. That's why I think that the problem is maybe getting worse over time. And until people on the left sort of also come to their senses, and I've been talking about that civil war that's happening on the left as well. There's camps on both sides of that divide as well. And right. I'm really hopeful. I really hope that the liberal left, the classically liberal people who still believe in sort of basic individual rights and limits, and they don't see politics purely as a war in which the whole goal is to acquire power and destroy our enemies. I want the liberal left to win that divide, because I think that's a sort of prerequisite. We have to turn the temperature down on both sides. Otherwise, it's a ratchet effect where both sides are constantly being radicalized by the radicalism of the other side.
No, you're right. And look, even in 2016, I said, if I would tell libertarians and conservatives, if you want a president AOC, then go ahead and elect a President Trump, because that's what it's going to result in, right? Like, he's not going to be president forever. Your political power is going to wane eventually, and the people you've been abusing are going to have long memories, and they're going to come back. And the only thing on their mind is not going to be to just, okay, let's get back to the normal guardrails. It's going to be, how can we inflict the most pain that we can, just like the cycle you just described. So you're absolutely right. Okay. Wow. I love this conversation. I wish it could go on forever, but let me just wrap this part up. Do you think fusionism in say the Frank Meyer vision of fusionism, his vision of fusionism, do you think it still has a place? Do you think we can still work our way towards it and have it be sort of like a path to being reasonable, as we said at the outset?
I absolutely do. I think a few years ago, there was a sense that fusionism is dead. Reagan-style conservatism is dead. It's not coming back. there's no point in even trying. And I think that was totally premature and wrong. So part of the reason I wrote this book was to say these are enduring principles. I mean, this idea that liberty and virtue are both necessary for human flourishing, either it's true or it's not true. But if it's true, it doesn't cease to be true because at the end of the Cold War or something, which is the way people tend to talk about fusionism as like, well, maybe it was okay during the Reagan era, but it's not relevant today. No, it's just as relevant today if it was right then. And I think it was right then. I think it was right then. And so I'm not saying that I'm making a prediction that the fusionist camp is going to come out victorious, but I think it's very much still a live debate. There are all kinds of people who still believe these things and who are not going to just lie down and let the sort of movement or the country be taken over by these anti-liberal forces. And so I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I think it's going to be very interesting to watch in the coming years.
I agree. Stephanie Slade, thank you so much for this. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. But before you go, I've got something I call the final five. These are 5 questions just meant to show rapid fire what's in your mind and how you think, perhaps a little bit more of your personality. So here we go. Okay. Number 1, you're a libertarian Catholic, as you described, who works at a magazine of free minds and free markets. At any given moment, do you think there's a percentage of your colleagues who quietly think you're a walking contradiction?
Maybe, yes. But I will say Reason is very much a big tent libertarian kind of place. And we have, a thing I've discovered from working there for all these years is that the ethos of libertarian toleration, of like, you do you and I'll do me and we can all be friends, runs so deep and is so sincere that like it applies even to the, the girl who's like going to Bible study on Tuesdays, as well as the people who are like doing psychedelic mushrooms in their free time.
Okay. Great answer. What's the most persuasive argument you've heard from someone who you fundamentally disagree with?
Oh, that's so hard. I mean, I'm very pro-immigration. That's where I come down on immigration policy. And I was taken aback by the backlash that we've seen in recent years to, again, not just illegal immigration, but the idea of any immigration being a problem and we need to send them all back and stuff. But I looked into it and I realized that actually the Biden administration, when I looked at the numbers, I realized that the Biden administration really had overseen an unprecedentedly large influx of people that they were allowing in under various, mechanisms having to do with refugees and asylees and all in ways that had never been done before. And so it has made me realize that sort of listening to those arguments made me realize that the way you go about pursuing your policies matters, not just thinking this is the better outcome, this is the outcome I support, but you got to do it the right way, or else you will sort of, well, for what you'll see the moral high ground, but also you'll potentially, end up setting your cause back farther.
Yeah. I always say for libertarians, they have to show their work, particularly for that reason. You can have the right conclusion, but how you get there is equally as important. Okay. Is there a position held by the dissident right that you secretly think, okay, they have a point there?
For the most part, because I can agree with them on, this is the flip side of this, I can agree with them on the outcomes in some cases that they want. But I'm just so totally against empowering the state to coercively impose one side on everyone else that I hesitate to say that I agree. There probably are examples. And again, I would say I want to give some credit to, they have been among those who have been banging the drums on the immigration issue, and in some cases in terms that I find appalling and racist. But there is this idea, J.D. Vance has said this, that the American people want less immigration, and they keep voting for less immigration, and the elites of both parties keep giving them more immigration. And at some point, you're gonna have a backlash if you do that. And so I think that's a reasonable point, that we need to build up the popular support for the policies that we believe in. That we believe in, even if we're right and they're wrong about whether it's going to be good or bad for the economy. You got to do the work. You got to do the work first.
All right. It's late at night. You've just been through a horrible podcast show with a Rube for a host. What comfort food do you turn to make it all feel better?
My go-to snack is popcorn.
Popcorn.
Yes, popcorn.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Is it that gourmet popcorn or just any, like you get that Jiffy Pop or whatever it is, and you're
Yeah,
happy?
the microwavable Orville Redenbacher's. I'm not fancy.
Okay, fair enough. All right, and the last question here: if someone wanted to understand your worldview without reading a single political book, which movie, novel, or song, or other piece of art would you assign them to watch to say this is what Stephanie believes?
These are hard questions.
I'm sorry.
So non-political books.
Yeah, you
I'll
can't Locke or Hayek or anything like that.
Right, sure. I'll name, a beloved novel among Catholics is Brideshead Revisited, which is also one of my favorite novels, and I think that's the one I would put out there.
Okay. Stephanie, thank you so much. Please tell the people about your upcoming book, where they can find it, and where they can otherwise find your other great work.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I write for Reason Magazine. You can read us at reason.com. We still have a print magazine that comes out 10 times a year that you can subscribe to, but you can also just read us on our website, as most people do these days. My book, which is called Fusionism, Liberty, Virtue, and the Future of the American Right, which is a history of the conservative movement in the 20th century and contrasting with what we're seeing today and making the case for why fusionism really is still the right way forward. It will be out on September 1st, but you can currently pre-order it anywhere from the University of Notre Dame Press website. You can order it from Amazon. You can order it from wherever books are sold, pre-order it, and then it would be delivered to you on September 1st when it comes out. And I'm just really excited. This is my first book, so I'm just really, really excited to see how it will be received and to hear from people what they think.
All right, everyone, go order Stephanie's book. Make her feel better about herself and her work, which is obviously outstanding. All right. Until next time, please like and subscribe to the channel. Join me again next time. We'll talk about something else of interest like we did today. Well, then, this has been Big John. Peace, everyone.